A true story about this grandma, how her family secrets changed everything. The invitation that wasn't. Marilyn had spent 3 years planning the perfect family vacation. It wasn't just any trip, it was a trip to Hawaii, a place that held significant sentimental value. The idea had blossomed in her heart many years ago, a dream sparked by memories of her honeymoon with James, her late husband. They had been young and broke, sharing a single suitcase and splitting sandwiches for lunch. But despite their financial struggles, they had laughed, and the island had left a lasting imprint on their hearts. James, with his adventurous spirit and love for the ocean, had always promised her they would come back when they could afford it. He never lived to see that promise fulfilled, but Marilyn had held onto it like a treasure. Now, as a grandmother, Marilyn decided to make that dream a reality for her children and grandchildren. She knew this vacation wasn't just about the destination, it was about bringing her family together. She hoped the beauty of Hawaii would remind them of the love that had built their family, the shared memories, the sacrifices, and, perhaps, the connection they once had. Every detail was carefully arranged: the beachfront villa, the flights, the excursions. Marilyn even spent time speaking with the travel agent to ensure everything would go smoothly for her son Nathan's family, including his wife Tanya's mother, who had difficulty walking. She imagined their time together would be perfect, a family united, a chance to share in the place James had loved so much. The anticipation swelled inside her as she thought of the grandkids running along the shore, of family dinners around the table, and of the small traditions they would create. But 2 nights before the trip, everything fell apart. Marilyn was at home finishing up the final touches for the trip. She had placed travel-sized sunscreen bottles into bags labeled for each of the grandchildren, lovingly wrapped little souvenirs, and even packed a small candle with lavender scent, James's favorite. She felt a rush of excitement at the thought of finally seeing her family together in the place that meant so much to her. Her hands were still sticky from the tape, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional buzz of her phone. Then the message came. It was from Nathan, and it hit Marilyn like a punch to the gut. "You won't be joining us. My wife prefers to keep it only her family," the text read. "You've already done your part by paying." For a moment, Marilyn didn't know how to respond. The words blurred on the screen in front of her. She had given everything for this family, invested years of her life and hard-earned savings into this trip, only to be told she was no longer wanted. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the cold, unfeeling tone of them. No explanation, no apology, no thanks. Just an abrupt message that made her feel like an outsider in the family she had spent her life building. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. The trip had been her dream, something she had sacrificed for, and now it was being taken away from her, as if her presence no longer mattered. Marilyn had known for a while that things were changing, that the dynamic between her and Tanya had shifted. Tanya had been increasingly distant, correcting her in front of the children and taking over the holiday traditions. But Marilyn never imagined that Nathan, her own son, would go along with it. She put the phone down on the table and looked around her kitchen. It was still and quiet, but the silence was deafening. She wasn't angry, not yet. She didn't know how she felt. The disappointment weighed on her like a stone. The idea that she had given so much, and it still wasn't enough to be included in the family she had built, made her question everything. There were no phone calls, no kind words from Nathan. He didn't even seem to acknowledge the years of love she had poured into their family, into him. Instead, she had become an afterthought, a person they could discard now that the money was in place. The trip was booked, the flights were set, and it seemed that's all they needed from her. Her love, her presence, her memories, none of it mattered. For Marilyn, this wasn't just about a vacation. It was about a family she had devoted herself to, a family she had believed in. But now, standing there in her kitchen, she felt like a ghost. No one saw her, no one heard her, not even Nathan, the boy she had raised, who once wrote her Mother's Day cards that made her cry, who once brought her tulips every March. That version of Nathan, the one who valued her, seemed to be gone. And in that moment, Marilyn realized the painful truth. She was no longer part of their story. She had been frozen out, dismissed, erased from the very life she had worked so hard to create.
The dream of a family trip. For Marilyn, the dream of this family trip had been built on more than just the allure of tropical beaches or exotic adventures. It was rooted in love, a love she had nurtured for decades. The vision was clear, a beautiful, restorative moment for her family, a time to reconnect, reflect, and share in the richness of their past. The trip wasn't merely about vacations or holidays. It was about creating lasting memories that would carry them through their lives, something they could look back on when life inevitably brought challenges. Her late husband, James, had been the dreamer in their relationship. Together, they had built a life full of small but meaningful moments. And despite their humble beginnings, they had managed to carve out a life that was rich in love, laughter, and shared experiences. Marilyn wanted to pass that legacy on to her children and grandchildren. She wanted them to know the depth of their family's history, the sacrifices made, the lessons learned, and the strength found in unity. What better way to do that than by revisiting the place that had once been so central to her and James? She meticulously planned every detail of the trip, going above and beyond to ensure everyone would be comfortable. She considered everything from the type of beds to the dietary needs and accessibility for Tanda's mother. Marilyn's devotion to this trip wasn't just financial, it was emotional. She had been the one to take the lead, organizing the accommodations, handling the payments, and making the countless small decisions that would turn this trip into something unforgettable. When she looked at her grandkids, she pictured them playing on the beach, laughing in the sand, and hearing her voice telling them stories about their grandfather, James. She imagined how they would learn about his love for the ocean, how they would come to understand the sacrifices he had made to bring them into the world. Marilyn had hoped this trip would serve as a bridge, a chance to bring the family back to the roots they had all shared, a reminder that they were more than just individuals, more than just players in their own lives. They were a family, bound by history, love, and memories. In her mind, Hawaii wasn't just a vacation destination. It was a symbol of everything James had worked so hard for. It represented love, joy, and commitment. Marilyn's dream was that this trip would honor that legacy, that her children and grandchildren would understand the depth of her feelings and the importance of family. It was supposed to be a celebration of the love that had shaped their lives, an opportunity to reconnect and create new memories that would last a lifetime. She had spent hours researching the best villas, ensuring they were not only beautiful, but also accessible. Marilyn considered every detail: the flight times, the transfers, the special requests for the children. She envisioned them all gathered around the table at night, talking about James, laughing, and reminiscing. She imagined the stories that would be told, the memories that would be created, and the warmth of the family coming together under the Hawaiian sky. Yet, as she stood in her kitchen that evening, preparing for a trip that was meant to heal and unite, Marilyn found herself standing on the precipice of something much darker. The phone message she had received, the message that erased her from the family picture, was not just a simple miscommunication. It was a betrayal. A betrayal of her love, of her devotion, and, most painfully, of her trust. The trip that she had poured so much into, both financially and emotionally, was slipping through her fingers. And in that moment, she realized how much she had underestimated the distance between her and the family she had once thought she could count on. She had believed in the idea of family, of unconditional love and support. But what she had failed to see, what had become all too clear in the wake of Nathan's text, was that for some, love had conditions. It was transactional. It was about what you could give and not about who you were. And for Marilyn, that was the most painful revelation of all. Her role had been reduced to that of a mere financial contributor. The love and care she had so freely given had been taken for granted, and in return, she had been dismissed. The words in Nathan's message, cold and impersonal, made it clear. She had done her part by paying, and now she was no longer needed. The emotional investment she had made in the family was worth nothing to them. What they wanted from her now was simply money, and once that had been secured, her presence no longer mattered. For a moment, Marilyn was paralyzed. She had no idea what to do. She had imagined this trip for so long, had worked tirelessly to make it happen, and now it was falling apart. Her first instinct was to pick up the phone and call Nathan, to ask him why he had made this decision, why he had turned his back on her after all she had done. But she stopped herself. There would be no pleading, no begging. She had been a mother, a grandmother, and a woman of strength her entire life. She could not allow herself to beg for a place in her own family. Instead, she sat in silence, staring at the phone. The room felt suffocating, and the weight of rejection hung in the air. Marilyn could not help but wonder, when did she become invisible to them? When did the love she had so freely given transformed into something that was no longer enough? More importantly, how had she allowed herself to become so dependent on their approval, on their recognition? The truth was hard to swallow. Her family had outgrown her. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that they had never truly understood her. They had never seen her as more than a provider, someone who gave and gave without asking for anything in return. And now that they had given everything they could, they had moved on. The sadness was profound, but it was also a realization that her identity, her worth, could not be defined by their acknowledgement. Building trust through generosity. For Marilyn, the act of giving had always been natural. As a mother, she had sacrificed time, energy, and dreams to ensure her children were taken care of. As a grandmother, she had dedicated herself to creating a legacy, a life rich in love and memories, where every moment spent with family was one to cherish. To Marilyn, trust was the foundation of any relationship, and her actions had always been built on that trust. She had trusted Nathan, her son, to appreciate her sacrifices, to see the love behind every decision she made. She had trusted Tanya, her daughter-in-law, to understand that her role in the family was not just about being a grandmother or a mother-in-law, but about sharing in the collective experience of family life. She believed they both understood the depth of her commitment, the countless hours spent saving, planning, and envisioning this dream vacation. But with the coldness of Nathan's text, that trust was shattered. The words, "You've already done your part by paying," lingered in Marilyn's mind like an echo, reverberating through the very core of her being. It wasn't just the message, it was the assumption that money could replace love, that financial contributions were all that mattered. Marilyn had worked hard to fund the trip. She had saved for years, sacrificed small pleasures, and even sold her old furniture to make this dream a reality. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant, as if her presence and emotional investment had never truly been valued. Her relationship with Nathan had always been one of trust. He had been the son who, as a child, had written her the sweetest cards, who had called her his best friend in front of his teachers. She had kept his drawings, the ones where he had depicted her as a superhero, the captions proudly declaring, "My mom saves the day." To Marilyn, Nathan's love had been unconditional, or so she had thought. But now, it felt like all of that had been reduced to nothing more than a transaction. The realization was a hard pill to swallow. She had trusted him, had believed that the love she had invested in him over the years would be reciprocated with kindness and respect. She had believed that, at the very least, they would understand the importance of the trip, not just as a vacation, but as an opportunity to reconnect, to honor the memories of the past, and to create new ones. But as soon as the text arrived, Marilyn realized that for Nathan and Tanya, the vacation was nothing more than a set of plans, a checklist to be checked off. The emotional value she attached to it was lost on them. Marilyn sat there, staring at the phone, and began to question everything. Had she really been the mother and grandmother she thought she was? Had she given too much, asking for too little in return? She thought of all the sacrifices she had made over the years, the sleepless nights when Nathan was a child, the long hours she worked to ensure they could have a comfortable life, the way she had always put her family first. She had always believed that love was the driving force in a family, that it was through shared experiences and sacrifices that the bonds were formed. But now, she was faced with the cold reality that her family did not share her vision of love. The more she thought about it, the more the weight of the betrayal sank in. She had never expected anything in return, but she had hoped for recognition, for acknowledgement of all that she had done. And now, it seemed that her role had been reduced to that of a financial provider. The truth stung. She had spent years building trust with her family, but somewhere along the way, that trust had eroded. Her sacrifices had become obligations, her love had become a transaction. It wasn't just Nathan's text that hurt. It was the realization that her entire relationship with her family had been built on an uneven foundation. They had never fully appreciated the depth of her love, her dedication, or her unwavering support. They had never truly seen her. They had seen what she could offer: money, time, energy, but they had never seen the woman behind the sacrifices. They had never understood that what she truly craved was not gratitude, but connection. And in the absence of that connection, she had been left to wonder if she had made a mistake by giving so much. Marilyn thought about all the ways she had tried to show her family how much she loved them. The little things: packing their favorite snacks, organizing family gatherings, planning every detail of their lives. She had done it all because she believed in the power of family. But now, it seemed like all of that was meaningless. Nathan and Tanya's exclusion felt like a final, cruel reminder that no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough to earn the kind of love and respect she had hoped for. And yet, in the midst of the pain, there was something else, something Marilyn had not fully realized until that moment. This wasn't just about the vacation or about Nathan's refusal to include her. This was about her role in the family, and more importantly, her role in her own life. For years, she had lived for them. She had given everything, sacrificed everything. But in doing so, she had neglected herself. She had forgotten what it meant to be seen, to be valued, not for what she could give, but for who she was. Marilyn realized that, in her efforts to build a perfect family, she had lost sight of herself. She had poured so much love into her children and grandchildren that she had forgotten to nurture her own sense of worth. She had allowed them to define her, to determine her place in the family, and in doing so, she had allowed herself to become invisible. This was the true betrayal, the one that had nothing to do with money and everything with recognition, with being seen as more than just a giver, but as a person in her own right. It was a bitter truth, but it was also a liberating one. Marilyn knew in that moment that it was time to reclaim her life. She could no longer live for others. She needed to live for herself, to rediscover her worth and value beyond the role she had been playing. It wasn't too late. There was still time to build a life that was hers, not one defined by the expectations of others, but one where she could be seen, valued, and loved for the person she truly was. Tanya's growing influence. The change in the dynamics of Marilyn's family had been gradual but unmistakable. At first, it was subtle, small moments here and there that Marilyn could dismiss or attribute to misunderstandings. But as time passed, the shift became more pronounced. Tanya, her daughter-in-law, seemed to grow more distant, more controlling, and more determined to define the boundaries of family life according to her own rules. Marilyn had always admired Tanya, especially in the beginning. She was a hard-working woman, a devoted mother, and someone who clearly loved Nathan. They made a good pair, and Marilyn was happy to see her son settle down with someone who seemed to complement him so well. But over time, Tanya's behavior began to change, and Marilyn couldn't help but notice it. The way Tanya corrected her in front of the children, the way she rolled her eyes when Marilyn shared stories about the past, made her feel less like a mother and more like an outsider. It wasn't just that Tanya had started to take over holiday gatherings or that Marilyn was no longer consulted about family decisions. What really stung was the way Tanya made Marilyn feel invisible. Marilyn had always been the matriarch, the woman who held the family together, the one who planned the events, the one who remembered the birthdays and anniversaries. But Tanya had gradually taken on that role, and Marilyn was being pushed to the side. There was an incident at Thanksgiving that made Marilyn realize just how much Tanya's influence had taken over. The family was gathered at the dinner table, and Marilyn had been excited to suggest taking a family photo, something they hadn't done in years. She thought it would be a nice way to capture the moment, to hold on to the memories of being together. But when she suggested it, Tanya quickly brushed her off. "Let's do one of just the kids," Tanya said, her tone dismissive. "And one with just our family unit," she added, effectively excluding Marilyn from the picture. When the photo was taken, Marilyn stood off to the side, not even part of the frame. She had been forgotten once again. It was these small, seemingly insignificant moments that gradually wore Marilyn down. At first, she tried to brush it off. After all, Tanya was just being practical, right? She didn't mean to hurt her feelings. But the pattern became harder to ignore. Family events were slowly becoming less about family and more about Tanya's vision of what the family should look like. Marilyn's input was no longer valued, her presence no longer acknowledged. When Christmas came around, it became even clearer. Tanya had organized the family's Christmas celebration at her own mother's house without even mentioning it to Marilyn until the day before. Marilyn had assumed she would be hosting, as she had done for years. It was a tradition, one that had been passed down through the generations. But this year, it was all happening at Tanya's mother's house, and Marilyn had been left out of the decision-making process entirely. Even when Marilyn arrived, Tanya acted as though she were a guest in her own home. At one point, Tanya casually mentioned to a friend, "Nathan's mom is here too," as if Marilyn had just wandered in uninvited. That remark stung more than any harsh word could have. Marilyn had given so much to this family, and yet here she was, being treated like an outsider, like someone who was no longer needed. As time passed, it became clear that the family Marilyn had poured her heart and soul into was slipping away from her. The roles she had once held, wife, mother, grandmother, seemed to be fading into the background, replaced by Tanya's vision of how things should be. It was as if Marilyn's contributions to the family no longer mattered. The love she had shown, the sacrifices she had made, seemed to be invisible. Tanya was the new center of attention, and Marilyn was being quietly erased. But what hurt the most was that Nathan, her own son, was going along with it. She had always believed that Nathan would be the one to stand up for her, to recognize the value of her presence in the family. But now it seemed that he had allowed Tanya to take over, to redefine what family meant in a way that excluded the woman who had raised him, who had loved him unconditionally. Marilyn tried to confront Nathan about it, but every time she brought up her feelings, he brushed it off. "Tanya's just trying to keep things simple," he would say. "She wants everything to go smoothly, and it's easier if we keep it small." It was always about Tanya's preferences, never about Marilyn's needs or feelings. Nathan seemed to be more concerned with keeping the peace than with ensuring his mother felt valued. He didn't seem to understand that his mother had been the one to create the family, to bring everyone together in the first place. The final straw came when Nathan texted her, informing her that she wasn't invited on the trip to Hawaii. The coldness of the message was like a slap in the face. She had paid for the entire vacation, had spent years saving for it, and yet she was being excluded. Tanya's preferences had taken precedence over everything Marilyn had built. The dream of a family vacation had been shattered, and Marilyn found herself standing on the sidelines once again, forgotten and unwanted. It was clear now Tanya's influence had grown too strong, and Nathan had allowed it. The family Marilyn had dedicated her life to was no longer the family she recognized. It was now a family defined by Tanya's vision, by her rules, and Marilyn was no longer a part of that picture. The realization was painful, but it also forced Marilyn to confront a hard truth. She could no longer let herself be defined by others. If her family wouldn't see her, if they wouldn't value her, then it was time for her to find a new path, one where she could be seen, valued, and loved for who she truly was.
That night, as Marilyn sat in the quiet of her kitchen, staring at the phone in front of her, she could feel a knot of disbelief slowly tightening in her chest. The text from Nathan had been brief, unemotional, and direct. It didn't acknowledge any of the love or sacrifices she had made over the years. It didn't express any gratitude for the time, energy, or money she had invested in creating what she had hoped would be the perfect family reunion. No. Instead, it was a cold reminder that she was no longer considered an integral part of the family she had spent her life nurturing. "You won't be joining us. My wife prefers to keep it only her family. You've already done your part by paying." The words echoed in her mind. Marilyn sat there for a long while, feeling the weight of the message press down on her chest. She could hardly believe what she was reading. Her son, the boy she had raised, the boy who had once been so loving and so devoted to her, was telling her that she wasn't welcome to be part of this trip. The trip that she had paid for, planned, and dreamed of for years. It felt like a betrayal, not just of the money, but of everything she had ever done for them. She had envisioned a time of connection, of family bonding, where they could laugh together, remember James, and create new memories. Instead, she was left standing outside, a silent observer, reading a text that excluded her. At first, she thought about responding. She wanted to pick up the phone and tell Nathan how much his words had hurt her, how much the rejection stung. She wanted him to understand the depth of her feelings, to apologize, to somehow make this better. But as she stared at the phone, her fingers hovered over the screen, Marilyn realized something crucial. There would be no apology. There would be no reconciliation. Nathan had made his choice, and now it was time for her to make hers. In her heart, Marilyn knew she couldn't beg for a place in her own family. She had spent her entire life giving and giving, expecting nothing in return, only to be dismissed when she was no longer seen as useful. This wasn't just about the trip. It was about something deeper, something that had been festering for years. It was about her role in her family, her place in the narrative she had worked so hard to create. And that role had been erased, replaced by Tanya's version of what the family should look like. So instead of replying to the text, Marilyn placed her phone down on the table. She didn't even bother to call Nathan. She didn't need to explain herself. The text spoke volumes. It was a message not only about her exclusion from the trip, but also about how her family viewed her now. She had given so much to them, but in the end, she had been reduced to an afterthought. She took a deep breath and looked around the room. The kitchen, the house that had been filled with so much life and laughter over the years, now felt eerily quiet. The silence weighed heavily on her, but in it, Marilyn found a strange sense of clarity. She had been holding on to the hope that the family she had spent her life creating would still see her, would still recognize the love she had given them. But it was clear now that they didn't. For years, she had let her family define her. She had allowed her identity to be wrapped up in what she could give them: money, time, attention, and love. But now she realized that she had been giving in the wrong way. She had been giving without receiving, without ever asking for anything in return. And now that generosity had been taken for granted. In a moment of painful self-awareness, Marilyn understood that she had let herself be invisible to her family. She had allowed them to dictate her place in their lives, never once questioning if she deserved more. And now she was left with nothing but the cold reality that her love had been treated as a transaction, one in which her presence was no longer needed, just her financial contributions. The text had made it clear. Marilyn was no longer part of their plans. She had paid for the vacation, but her place at the table had been taken by Tanya's vision of what family should look like. The trip that had been meant to bring them together had instead become a symbol of everything Marilyn had lost: the love, the connection, and the recognition. In the end, all that was left was the bitter sting of being forgotten. But as she sat there, feeling the weight of the text, Marilyn made a decision. She would no longer allow herself to be treated like this. She would no longer give without being seen, without being valued. She would no longer let her family define her place in their lives. There was power in silence, and for the first time in a long while, Marilyn realized that silence was her strongest weapon. It wasn't about getting angry or trying to fix things. It was about reclaiming her autonomy, her identity, and her worth. She would no longer beg for a seat at the table. She would make her own path, one that didn't depend on the approval or recognition of those who had taken her for granted. The next morning, Marilyn woke up earlier than usual. The silence in the house felt different now, less suffocating and more peaceful. She had made a choice. She would not be a silent victim to her family's disregard. Instead, she would take control of her own story. She would not let herself be erased. As the day went on, Marilyn found herself looking at her travel fund account, the money she had saved, the money she had worked so hard to accumulate. It was hers. It wasn't just about the trip anymore. It was about something far more important: her sense of self-worth. Marilyn opened her laptop, logged into her account, and froze the funds. She could hear the sound of her heart beating in her chest. It was a small, quiet victory, but it felt enormous. Marilyn knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let her family use her like this anymore. The lesson had been painful, but it had also been liberating. She was no longer going to play the role they had assigned her: the good, sacrificing mother and grandmother who was always there to pick up the pieces. No, this time she would pick up the pieces for herself. And if her family couldn't see that, then that was their loss. The cold text had made it clear. that Nathan and Tanya weren't going to value her. But Marilyn was determined to start valuing herself. The final straw. The day after receiving Nathan's cold message, Marilyn went through a mix of emotions. There was anger, but it wasn't the kind of anger that burned hot and quick. It was the kind of anger that slowly bubbled up over time, a simmering frustration that had been building for years. It was the kind of anger you feel when you realize that you've been playing a role that others have written for you, a role that doesn't take into account your needs, your desires, or your worth. The betrayal she felt wasn't just about being excluded from the vacation. It was about the years of being taken for granted, the years of giving everything she had to her family and receiving so little in return. Marilyn had always thought that the love she gave was unconditional, that her children and grandchildren would see her for who she was, not just for what she could do for them. But now she realized that wasn't the case. To them, she was a provider, a source of money, someone who could be relied upon when it was convenient. When her presence wasn't needed, she was easily forgotten. It wasn't just Tanya's influence that had pushed Marilyn to the edge. It was the lack of respect from Nathan. He was the one who had been the closest to her, the one she had spent countless hours with, shaping him into the man he had become. She had believed that he would stand by her, that he would appreciate the sacrifices she had made. But instead, he had stood idly by, allowing Tanya to take over everything. Nathan hadn't even tried to defend her when Tanya made her feel invisible. He hadn't tried to recognize the emotional labor Marilyn had invested in their family. As the hours passed, Marilyn's feelings of betrayal grew more intense. She had worked so hard to make this vacation happen, thinking it would be
The power of control. Once Marilyn made the decision to freeze the travel fund, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just about stopping the financial transactions, it was about taking back control of her life. For years, she had lived on the edges of her family's expectations, always striving to meet their needs, to be the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother, the perfect giver. But now she was no longer playing by their rules. She was writing her own story, one where she was seen, valued, and appreciated for who she was, not just for what she could provide. It's funny how quickly things can change once you stop being afraid of standing up for yourself. For so long, Marilyn had allowed herself to be defined by her role in her family. She was the caretaker, the provider, the one who always put others first. She had convinced herself that this was her place, that this was the role she had been assigned in life. But now she saw it for what it was, an unspoken agreement where she was expected to give without ever asking for anything in return. The truth was, her family had taken her for granted, and she had let them. The first step in reclaiming her life was small, but it felt monumental. Freezing the account wasn't just a financial decision, it was a declaration of independence. It was Marilyn saying, "I am not a tool, a bank account, or a passive player in my own life. I have value, and I will no longer be treated like I don't." The simple click of a button had given her the power to take control back from the family that had forgotten her, from the family that had reduced her to a mere provider. Marilyn wasn't filled with anger. Instead, she felt a sense of relief and clarity. She had been living in the shadow of her family's expectations for far too long. She had been so busy trying to keep everyone happy, so caught up in their needs, that she had forgotten about her own. And in that moment of freezing the funds, Marilyn realized how much power she had always had, how much power she had given away without even realizing it. She didn't need to ask for permission to take control of her own life. She didn't need to beg her son or daughter-in-law to recognize her worth. She had always known it deep down, and now it was time for her to act on it. In the days that followed, Marilyn didn't dwell on the phone calls and messages she was ignoring. The constant barrage of texts from Nathan asking if she could help with the trip seemed almost comical now. They were scrambling, realizing too late that the vacation they had planned was no longer going to happen as they had imagined. Marilyn was no longer going to be their safety net, their fallback plan, and she wasn't going to apologize for it. Instead, she began making her own plans, independent of her family's chaos. She started thinking about what she truly wanted, what she had been denying herself for years. It wasn't luxury or extravagant vacations. It was peace, it was freedom, and it was the ability to take care of herself without feeling guilty. Marilyn began to make small changes in her life, beginning with the decision to take a break from trying to please everyone. She didn't need to carry the weight of her family's expectations any longer. Marilyn had always been the one to hold the family together, to be the glue that kept everyone bonded. She had hosted Thanksgiving dinners, birthday parties, and Christmas gatherings for years. She had taken on the role of caretaker without hesitation. But she now realized that the family wasn't as bonded as she had thought. Instead, it was held together by her efforts, and when those efforts were no longer available, the bonds began to fray. Her decision to stop the vacation didn't come from a place of spite. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about a simple truth. She deserved more. Marilyn deserved to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued not just for what she could give, but for who she was. The trip had been her dream, not just for the sake of a family vacation, but for the sake of connection, of being acknowledged as part of the family's fabric. But that dream had been shattered by exclusion, by the cold, transactional way her family had treated her. And so she chose to let go. The vacation would not happen, but she would make new plans for herself. Plans that included people who saw her, who appreciated her, and who were willing to invest in a relationship with her that was not built on what she could provide. In the meantime, Marilyn didn't have any contact with Nathan. She didn't need to explain herself. The more time passed, the more she realized that her silence spoke volumes. Nathan had made his choices, and Marilyn wasn't interested in being dragged back into a situation that no longer valued her. She had already been clear about what she wanted, and now it was time for her to focus on her own journey. The family may have moved forward with their plans, but Marilyn was moving forward with hers. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt empowered. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She didn't need one. She was creating her own happiness without needing anyone's approval. Marilyn knew there were people out there who would value her for the right reasons. People who saw her for who she was, not for what she could do for them. The time had come for her to let go of the toxic parts of her life and begin again. It wasn't about revenge, it was about self-preservation. It was about reclaiming the power that had always been hers, but had been buried under years of sacrifice and expectation. As Marilyn looked out her window that morning, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had taken the first step towards a new chapter, one where she would no longer be invisible. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally beginning to live for herself. New beginnings. Marilyn had never been one to give up easily. She had fought for her family, for her place in their lives, for her role as a mother and grandmother. But now, after everything that had happened, something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just fighting for a place anymore. She wasn't fighting for recognition or for a seat at the table. Marilyn had come to realize that she no longer needed anyone's approval to live a fulfilling, meaningful life. She was enough, just as she was. It was a revelation, one that came with both pain and clarity. For years, she had built her identity around the roles she played for others. She was the doting mother, the loving grandmother, the one who always made sure everyone was taken care of. But in all of that giving, she had forgotten who she was. She had neglected herself in favor of the needs of her family. Now, as she sat in her cozy living room, sipping her favorite tea, she realized she had a chance to redefine herself. She could feel it in the air, a new sense of possibility. Marilyn had always been someone who worked hard for what she wanted, but she had always done so with others in mind. Now, it was time for her to focus on herself. It wasn't selfishness, it was survival. She had given so much of herself for so long that she had lost touch with the things that made her happy. Marilyn thought back to the dream vacation she had planned for her family, the trip that had been meant to bring them together in Hawaii. That dream had crumbled, but in its place she saw a new opportunity, an opportunity to create something for herself. She didn't need a beachfront villa or expensive excursions. She needed peace, time to reflect, and the chance to nurture her own well-being. The truth was, the family trip had always been more about her desire to feel valued and appreciated than about the destination itself. It had been about reconnecting with her children, her grandchildren, and honoring her late husband's memory. But what she had failed to realize was that the trip was only a small piece of the puzzle. What she truly needed was to create relationships based on mutual respect, relationships where her presence was appreciated, not just her financial contributions. Marilyn began to make small changes. She stopped volunteering for every family event, no longer the first to offer help when something needed to be done. She still loved her family, but she stopped allowing them to take her for granted. Instead, she started setting boundaries. She learned to say no when she needed to, and to put her own needs first. She wasn't being cold or distant. She was simply teaching herself the art of self-care, something she had long neglected. In this new chapter of her life, Marilyn also started to reconnect with friends she hadn't seen in years. She reached out to Carol from church, who had always been there for her, and Louise, the widow who had never gotten to take a real vacation. Marilyn shared her thoughts and feelings with them, and they too had stories of sacrifice and neglect. In some ways, they were all in the same boat. Women who had given their hearts and souls to others and had been overlooked, ignored, or taken for granted. Together, they formed a quiet but powerful community. They shared their experiences, their heartaches, and their triumphs. They didn't need extravagant trips or grand gestures to feel seen. All they needed was to be Marilyn had never anticipated how much her life would change after taking that first step of reclaiming control. It wasn't just a financial decision, it was a moment of personal liberation. But what followed that decision was even more profound, a sense of purpose and clarity about the kind of life she wanted to live moving forward. She had spent so much of her life being defined by others' expectations, and now she was stepping into a new chapter, one that centered on her own needs, desires, and passions. And part of that journey was reconnecting with women who had walked similar paths, those who had been marginalized, forgotten, or ignored by society or their own families. Marilyn's first step toward healing was not just about her own personal growth, but about lifting up others who had experienced the same quiet exclusion and emotional neglect. She thought of Carol, a woman from her church whose children hadn't visited her in years, of Louise, who had spent most of her life caring for her late husband's memory, only to be left behind when he passed, and of Beverly, who had sacrificed so much for her brother suffering from dementia, but had never once been acknowledged for her efforts. These women, women like her, deserved the kind of love and care that Marilyn had long been denied. Each of them had endured in silence, feeling unseen in their families or communities, their selflessness often going unnoticed. They were women of quiet strength, always giving, never asking for anything in return. Marilyn realized that she had the opportunity to show them something she herself had never received, the understanding that they, too, mattered. This would be a trip of restoration, not just to a physical destination, but to a place where they could reconnect with their own sense of worth, reclaiming their narratives and rewriting the stories that had long left them feeling invisible. Marilyn carefully selected the women she would invite. They weren't just friends, they were kindred spirits, each with a story that mirrored her own in some way. These were the women who, like her, had been overlooked. It was easy to understand why they hadn't been included in family gatherings, why their presence had been sidelined or minimized. Society often took for granted the strength of women who quietly gave of themselves. But Marilyn knew their strength, and she wanted to show them that they were not alone. She called them one by one, hesitantly at first, unsure of how they might react. Would they even want to go on such a trip? Will they feel uncomfortable, unworthy of such an invitation? But to her surprise, each woman responded with gratitude, even disbelief. It wasn't the trip itself that moved them. It was the idea that someone saw them, someone cared enough to offer them a moment of respite, a moment of healing. Marilyn's call became a lifeline, an opportunity to experience the world not as caretakers or afterthoughts, but as people who deserved joy, laughter, and peace. The excitement in their voices was contagious. The women were eager, not just for the trip, but for what it symbolized, a chance to be seen, to reclaim the space they had been denied. They were no longer just the women who served others in silence. They were women who mattered, women with stories worth telling, women who had lived lives of service without ever being recognized for it. Now they would step into a space where they could be celebrated, not for their sacrifices, but for who they were at their core. Marilyn, in her own quiet way, was creating something truly beautiful. She wasn't just providing a vacation. She was offering these women a chance to breathe, to reflect, and to share memories that were uniquely their own. In this new chapter of her life, Marilyn understood that real love and care weren't about grand gestures or fulfilling obligations. They were about connection, about truly seeing the person in front of you and understanding their worth. For too long, these women had given everything to others without receiving anything in return. Now Marilyn was showing them that they didn't have to keep giving in silence.
They deserved to be recognized, to be valued for their essence, not just their actions. The trip to Hawaii would be a chance to bask in that recognition, to be reminded that their stories mattered, that they had lived full, meaningful lives, even if the world had often overlooked them. The preparations for the trip were different this time. There were no endless to-do lists for meals or accommodations to make everyone happy. Marilyn focused on what would truly bring joy and peace to these women. A safe, comfortable place to stay, plenty of time for reflection, and opportunities to simply enjoy each other's company. It wasn't about making it perfect, it was about making it meaningful. As Marilyn sat in her living room, her heart full of anticipation, she thought back to the family vacation that had never happened, the one that had been canceled when she was excluded. It still hurt, but the pain wasn't as sharp as it had been. She had realized something important in the process of reclaiming her own life. Sometimes the best way to heal a wound is to redirect your energy into something more positive. The healing would come not from begging for inclusion or acknowledgement, but from creating her own path, one where she no longer depended on others to validate her worth. In many ways, Marilyn had found a new family in the women she had chosen to invite. She wasn't abandoning her own biological family. She was simply recognizing that there were other forms of family, other bonds that could be just as strong, just as meaningful. These women weren't just guests on her trip, they were companions, fellow travelers on a journey of rediscovery. They were women who had walked similar roads, who had sacrificed quietly, and who for far too long had gone unnoticed. It wasn't about revenge or even about proving something to her family. It was about restoring dignity, honoring the experiences that had shaped these women, and celebrating their resilience. Marilyn had found peace in knowing that she had done something beautiful for the right reasons. This was no longer about what she had lost, but about what she could still create. The trip wasn't just about seeing the ocean or experiencing Hawaii. It was about the healing that comes from truly being seen. As the day of departure grew nearer, Marilyn's excitement grew with it. She wasn't carrying the weight of the past anymore. She wasn't waiting for an apology or for her family to recognize her worth. She was living in the moment, enjoying the anticipation of what was to come. And as she boarded the plane with her chosen companions, Marilyn felt a sense of freedom she had never known before. She had given so much of herself to others, but now it was time to give to herself. And in doing so, she was giving these women the gift of being seen, valued, and loved.
The healing vacation. As the plane soared above the clouds, Marilyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The journey she was on was not just a physical one, it was an emotional voyage as well. There was something profoundly healing in knowing that she was no longer living her life on someone else's terms. She wasn't trying to please anyone anymore. She had taken charge of her own happiness, and now she was sharing that gift with the women who had become her true companions. The women had begun to bond almost immediately as they sat together on the plane, sharing stories of their lives, their sacrifices, and their dreams. Each one had a unique story, but there was a common thread that ran through all of them. They had all spent their lives giving without receiving. They had been the caregivers, the nurturers, the ones who always put others first. And somewhere along the way, they had lost sight of themselves. As they landed in Hawaii and made their way to the villa, the beauty of the place was undeniable. The air smelled of salt and flowers, and the ocean stretched out before them in a vast expanse of blue. But it wasn't just the scenery that was breathtaking. It was the atmosphere.
The feeling that they were finally in a place where they could relax, where they could truly be themselves without the weight of the world on their shoulders. The villa was everything Marilyn had hoped for and more. There was no pressure to be anything other than who they were. They weren't there to impress anyone or to live up to anyone's expectations. It was a space where they could just be. They spent their days sitting on the beach, talking, laughing, and reflecting on their lives. They shared stories that were painful, stories that were joyful, and everything in between. But most of all, they shared a sense of belonging, something they had all longed for, but had never truly felt in their families or communities. Marilyn watched as Carol, Louise, Beverly, and the others began to open up in ways they hadn't in years. They were no longer just the women who gave and gave without acknowledgement. They were women who were being heard, who were being seen, who were being valued. Marilyn didn't have to say much. Her actions had already spoken for her. By simply inviting them to this space, she had given them the gift of presence. There was something profoundly transformative about the way the group came together. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just carrying the weight of their individual lives. They were lifting each other up, sharing in the joy of being together, of being seen for who they truly were. Marilyn thought back to the moments when she had felt excluded from her own family, the way they had made her feel like an afterthought. But now, in this villa, surrounded by women who understood her, she realized something important. Sometimes, the most powerful connections are not the ones we are born into, but the ones we choose. Each night, they gathered around the table where Marilyn had placed the photo of her late husband James in the center. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was simply a reminder of the love that had shaped her life, of the bond that had brought her here to this moment. As they lit candles one by one, each woman shared a word or a memory that defined them. Some spoke of love, others of loss. Some spoke of strength, others of vulnerability. But all of them spoke with a sense of peace, of release. It was a simple ritual, but it carried a depth of meaning that couldn't be captured in words alone. For Marilyn, this was a moment of profound healing. She had dreamed of a family reunion in Hawaii, a chance to bring everyone together. But in the end, it wasn't the family she had given everything to who stood by her side. It was these women, the ones who had also given so much of themselves, and yet had been forgotten, sidelined, and overlooked. This trip wasn't just about a vacation. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from them, their dignity, their worth, and their right to be seen. The healing wasn't just physical, with the sound of the ocean waves washing over them, but emotional and spiritual as well. Marilyn had found what she had been searching for all along. A sense of belonging not based on obligation or blood ties, but on mutual respect, love, and understanding. As the days passed, Marilyn found herself growing stronger. She was no longer looking for validation from her family, from Nathan, or from anyone else. She had found that validation within herself. And in doing so, she had created a space where these women could find that same strength. They weren't seeking validation anymore either. They were celebrating who they were, embracing their own stories, and understanding that they were enough, just as they were. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the ocean, Marilyn took a deep breath. She felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Not just for the trip, not just for the women she had brought with her, but for the journey she had taken to get here. She thought about the painful moments when she had felt invisible, when her family had excluded her, when she had been told that her love and sacrifices were not enough. But now, as she watched the women laughing together on the beach, she realized that sometimes the greatest healing comes when we choose to let go of the past and move forward with the people who truly see us for who we are. It wasn't the trip to Hawaii that had healed her. It was the relationships she had created, the bonds she had built, and the love she had rediscovered within herself. Marilyn knew that her family's rejection would always be a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She had taken control of her own narrative, and in doing so, she had built a new story, one of strength, resilience, and love. And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marilyn understood something vital. She was not alone. She never had been. And as long as she had the strength to keep going, she would always have a place in this world, one she had carved out for herself, one where she was seen, heard, and valued. The empty family vacation. Marilyn had been in Hawaii for nearly a week now, and the days were growing more meaningful with every passing moment. Her soul felt lighter with each shared laugh and each vulnerable conversation. She had slowly learned to take a deep breath and allow herself to exist fully in the present. The women around her, the ones who had walked similar roads of quiet sacrifice, had become more than just companions. They had become sisters in arms, fellow travelers on the road of life, who truly understood her in ways no one else had. But there were moments when the quiet ache of exclusion crept into her heart. The family vacation she had imagined years ago was still alive in her memories, and sometimes, when the waves were particularly loud or the sun cast the most stunning glow on the water, she felt the sting of what could have been. She had dreamed of seeing her family gathered on the beach, playing in the sand, laughing together under the Hawaiian sky, and remembering her late husband James as they lit a candle in his memory. But that dream was gone, shattered by the cold text Nathan had sent. The vacation, the one she had paid for and meticulously planned for so long, had been ripped away from her, first by Tanya's preferences, then by Nathan's willingness to go along with it. Marilyn had fought back the tears that day, telling herself that she would be okay. But in quiet moments like this, with the sound of the ocean as her only companion, it was hard to ignore the emptiness of that lost opportunity. It wasn't just about the vacation. It was about the family she had given everything to, her love, her time, her energy, and who in the end had discarded her without so much as a second thought. Marilyn had been more than willing to pour herself into her family. She had sacrificed her own dreams, her own needs, because she believed in the idea of family, the togetherness, the support, the mutual care. But now, in this villa, surrounded by women who truly saw her, Marilyn understood that family didn't have to mean blood ties. It didn't have to mean giving everything you had to those who wouldn't recognize the depth of your love. It meant connection, respect, and mutual understanding. It meant being seen as a person, not just as a provider or an accessory in someone else's story. She thought of the moments when Tanya had corrected her in front of the children, or rolled her eyes when Marilyn shared stories about her and James's honeymoon in Hawaii. She remembered how Tanya had gradually taken over the holiday traditions, making it clear that Marilyn wasn't part of the new family narrative. She remembered how Nathan had distanced himself, allowing his wife's preferences to dictate the course of their family's relationships. That night, as the women gathered for another quiet dinner by the fire, Marilyn allowed herself to fully acknowledge the pain of being excluded from her family's plans. It wasn't just about the vacation. It was about the feeling that she had been erased from a family she had worked so hard to nurture. That feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a financial contributor, had haunted her more than she cared to admit. But as she sat with these women, Carol, Louise, Beverly, and the others, she realized something powerful. She no longer needed to apologize for being hurt. She didn't need to explain her pain or beg for their understanding. What happened with her family was what it was. It was their loss, not hers. They had chosen their path, and now she was choosing hers. Marilyn wasn't defined by their rejection. She had finally reached a place where she could let go of the past, of the expectation that her family would come around and embrace the freedom of self-worth. The women around her understood that in a way no one else could. They too had been dismissed, overlooked, or pushed aside by their families. And together, they had created a new family, one that didn't require them to sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of others. Here in this place, they could just be. They didn't have to explain themselves. They didn't have to seek approval. They were enough. Marilyn smiled as she looked around at the women gathered around the table. It wasn't the family reunion she had once dreamed of, but in some ways, it was better. This was a family built on mutual respect and love, not obligation. And it was a family that saw her not just as a mother, grandmother, or provider, but as a woman with her own life, her own needs, and her own voice. As they ate and talked late into the night, Marilyn knew that the time of dwelling on the past was over. Her family might have turned away from her, but these women, her chosen family, had shown her what true connection looked like. And that was worth far more than any vacation could ever be. The next morning, Marilyn took a walk on the beach alone. The sand was cool under her feet, and the ocean's rhythm seemed to soothe her spirit. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had learned about herself during this trip. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. She had let go of the anger, the hurt, and the disappointment that had clouded her heart for so long. She had learned that sometimes the greatest healing comes when we stop trying to hold on to what we can't change. She had spent so much of her life trying to be everything to everyone, but now she understood that she needed to be everything to herself. It was time for her to stop waiting for apologies, for acknowledgement, for recognition. She didn't need a place in her family's story anymore. She had created her own story, one that was filled with love, laughter, and the kind of connection she had long been denied. As she stood at the edge of the water, letting the waves wash over her feet, Marilyn felt something shift inside her. She was ready to move forward, to stop looking back at what she had lost. Her family's rejection had hurt, but it had also freed her. It had opened the door to a life she had never imagined. A life where she could define her own worth, create her own happiness, and embrace the relationships that truly mattered.
The power of shared stories. As the days passed in Hawaii, something remarkable happened. The women had transformed, not just in their shared experiences, but in the way they interacted with the world. They had arrived as individuals, each with their own burdens and stories, but by the end of the trip, they had become a community. Marilyn watched with a quiet sense of fulfillment as Carol, Louise, Beverly, and the others came alive in ways she hadn't expected. It was during one of their evening dinners that the depth of their transformation truly struck Marilyn. They were gathered around the table once again, the soft glow of the candles illuminating their faces, casting shadows that seemed to dance along with their words. It wasn't just a meal, it was a celebration of the journey they had taken together. That evening, as they shared their stories once more, Beverly spoke up with a sense of wonder in her voice. "You know," she said, looking around at the women seated beside her, "I never thought I'd feel seen like this. For so long, I've been so focused on caring for others, my brother, my family, that I forgot about myself. I used to think I was invisible. But now I see how much I've actually contributed to the world, even if no one ever recognized it before." Marilyn smiled softly at Beverly's words. She understood them deeply. For years, she had given and given to her family, only to feel invisible in return. She had spent so much time doing things for others, believing that her worth was measured by her ability to give, to serve. But now, surrounded by these women, she knew the truth. True worth isn't defined by how much you give, but by who you are. "I think we all feel that way," Carol chimed in. "I've spent so many years feeling like my family doesn't appreciate me. They don't understand the sacrifices I've made, the love I've poured into them. But now, with all of you, I don't feel like I need to justify anything. I just feel enough. I've spent too many years apologizing for needing something in return. But here, in this moment, I realize that I don't need anyone else's approval to know I matter." The words flowed easily now. It wasn't just the Hawaiian sunset or the relaxation of the trip that made them feel at ease. It was the simple act of being seen by one another. Each woman at that table had felt like an afterthought at some point in her life. Each had endured moments of rejection, whether from family, society, or even from themselves. But now, they shared an understanding that transcended any family tie. Here, there were no expectations, no pressure to be something they weren't. There was only the raw, beautiful truth of their experiences: pain, joy, laughter, and loss woven together into something powerful. Marilyn's heart swelled as she listened to these women, her new family. She had always thought family was about shared blood and shared history, but she had come to realize that family is about who you choose to surround yourself with.
It was about the people who lift you up, who value you for who you are, and who understand that love is not a one-way street. As the evening continued, each woman spoke her truth, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter, but always with a deep sense of relief. Marilyn didn't say much. She didn't need to. She was content to simply listen, her heart full as she saw these women reclaim their power. This trip, which had initially started as a way to heal her own wounds, had turned into something far more meaningful. It was a celebration of each woman's individual journey, a recognition that, despite the pain they had endured, they were not defined by their past. They were women who had survived, who had thrived, and who were ready to embrace a new chapter of their lives. The next morning, after breakfast, Marilyn stood on the balcony of the villa, looking out over the ocean. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the sea stretched out before her in an endless expanse. She thought of how far she had come, from the cold text that had excluded her from her own family's plans, to this moment where she felt more at peace with herself than ever before. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for someone to recognize her worth. She wasn't waiting for her family to come back to her or for Nathan to apologize for his thoughtless actions. She had already found everything she needed within herself. The trip had taught her that her worth didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. She was worthy because she was herself, because of the love she had given, the sacrifices she had made, and the strength she had shown in the face of adversity. The women came outside to join her, laughing as they ran toward the beach, eager to spend their last day together before returning home. Marilyn's heart felt light as she watched them. She had found a new family, one that valued her not for what she could give, but for who she was. As the day wore on, Marilyn found herself walking along the shore with Carol and Louise. The ocean was calm now, the waves gentle as they lapped at their feet. The women talked about their plans for when they returned home, about what they hoped to do next. For the first time in years, Marilyn felt optimistic. She wasn't returning to the same life she had left behind. She was returning to a life that she had chosen for herself. This trip had been a gift to herself, a reminder that she deserved to be seen, to be valued, and to be loved. She had stopped waiting for someone else to give her that validation. She had given it to herself. And in doing so, she had shown these women that they too deserved to be seen and appreciated for who they were. As they walked back to the villa, Marilyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that the future held many challenges, but she was no longer afraid. She had learned that she didn't need to rely on her family's approval or anyone else's for that matter. She had found her own strength, her own voice, and she would carry it with her wherever she went. The women's laughter filled the air as they reached the villa. Marilyn smiled softly to herself. This trip had been a turning point, a moment of healing, of self-discovery, and of connection. And as she stepped inside to join her friends, she knew that no matter what the future held, she was no longer invisible. She was a woman who had found her place in the world, and it was one she had created for herself.
The power of shared memories. The days in Hawaii passed quickly, each one marked by small moments of joy, laughter, and healing. The women had bonded over shared stories, some of which were heartbreaking, while others were filled with humor and hope. As they spent more time together, they discovered just how much they had in common. They weren't strangers to hardship or loss, and yet each had found a way to keep going. Their resilience wasn't just a matter of survival. It was about finding strength in their vulnerability, embracing their imperfections, and understanding that they weren't alone in their struggles. On the fourth day of their stay, they decided to take a break from the villa and head to the beach for a day of relaxation. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the sound of the waves crashing softly against the shore. As they walked along the beach, Marilyn couldn't help but notice how different this trip felt from the one she had originally planned for her family. It wasn't the luxury accommodations or the perfect itineraries that made it meaningful. It was the people she was with, the women who had become her chosen family. The group spent hours walking along the shoreline, picking up seashells and sharing stories from their past. Carol told them about the time her children had refused to visit her during Christmas, choosing instead to spend the holidays with their in-laws. Louise shared a funny memory of how she and her late husband had gotten lost on their honeymoon, ending up in a small town where they didn't speak the language. Beverly laughed as she described the time she had tried to learn how to hula dance at a local festival, only to trip over her own feet in front of an entire crowd. Each story was an invitation into the heart of the woman telling it, and each woman listened with compassion and understanding. Marilyn smiled as she listened to them. This was what she had been seeking all along, the connection that had been missing from her family, the recognition that these women, too, were worthy of love, laughter, and respect. They didn't need to be perfect. They didn't need to have everything figured out. All they needed was each other and the knowledge that they were enough. Later that evening, the group gathered around a bonfire on the beach. The sky had darkened, and the stars above seemed to shine brighter than ever. Marilyn had arranged for each woman to write down a memory or a word that represented something meaningful to them, something that encapsulated who they were, who they had become. As the flames flickered, they took turns sharing their thoughts. When it was Marilyn's turn, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I chose the word resilience," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "It's a word that describes all of us. We've all been through so much, but we're still here, still standing. And I think we've all learned that it's not about how many times we fall down. It's about how many times we get back up. I've spent my life trying to be everything to everyone, but this trip has reminded me that I need to be everything to myself, too. We all do." The other women nodded in agreement, and Marilyn felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not just for what she had done for others, but for who she was. She was no longer the invisible woman behind the scenes. She was a woman with her own story, her own strength, and her own worth. The next day, they took a boat tour to see the famous sea turtles that lived in the waters off the coast. Marilyn had been looking forward to this for days, imagining the joy on the faces of the women as they watched the turtles swimming in the clear blue water. As the boat drifted into a calm bay, the women eagerly donned their snorkels and masks, excited to see the turtles up close. Marilyn felt a sense of peace as she watched them, their faces lit up with awe and wonder. For the first time in a long while, Marilyn felt truly happy. Not because of the turtles, but because of the women surrounding her. These were the women who had taught her the value of friendship, the power of connection, and the importance of self-love.
Together, they had created a space where they could all be vulnerable, where they could share their pain and their joy without fear of judgment. And as Marilyn floated in the warm water, watching the sea turtles glide effortlessly beneath her, she realized that this trip was not just a healing journey, it was a journey of rediscovery. She had rediscovered herself, her strength, and the importance of being seen and valued for who she was. That evening, as they sat around the table once again, Marilyn reflected on how far they had come. She thought about the pain she had experienced when her own family had excluded her from their plans, the loneliness she had felt, and the way she had tried to make everyone happy only to end up invisible. But here, in this moment, she knew that the love and care she had given her family had not been in vain. It had shaped her into the woman she was today, a woman who knew her worth and was no longer willing to accept anything less. Marilyn looked around at the women, each one strong, resilient, and beautiful in their own way. They were no longer just the invisible mothers, grandmothers, and caretakers. They were women who had lived full, rich lives and had much to offer the world. Marilyn smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the journey she had taken and for the women who had joined her on this path. This trip was not just about Hawaii. It was about coming home to themselves. And as the fire crackled and the stars twinkled above, Marilyn knew that this was just the beginning. The next chapter of her life was unfolding, and it was a chapter where she would no longer be invisible. It was a chapter where she would be seen, loved, and appreciated for all the right reasons, not just for what she could give, but for who she truly was. The empty family message. As Marilyn returned from the trip to Hawaii, her heart was full and her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She had spent a week surrounded by women who understood her, who had laughed and cried with her, and who had reminded her of the strength that had always been within her. It was a journey she had never expected, but had needed deeply, one that had healed the wounds of rejection and restored her sense of self-worth. But as she settled back into her daily routine at home, reality began to seep in once again. The phone buzzed with a message from Nathan. "Mom, I hope you're doing well. We're back from the trip and I wanted to let you know that we're trying to sort through some things. We're all a little shaken by what happened, and I think we need to have a conversation about it when you're ready. Please call when you can. I miss you." For a moment, Marilyn sat there staring at the message, her heart heavy. Part of her wanted to respond right away, to demand an apology, to express how deeply hurt she had been. But another part of her, the part that had found peace on the beach in Hawaii, knew that this wasn't about a conversation with Nathan. This wasn't about begging for answers or trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. She had already let go of the idea of a perfect family reunion. What she had now, what she had gained, was far more valuable. Her own peace, her own worth, and the realization that she didn't need her family's approval to live a fulfilling life. Marilyn didn't respond immediately. She put the phone down and went for a walk in her garden, the same garden she had spent countless hours in over the years, tending to the flowers and plants that brought her so much joy.
The quiet of the garden, the chirping of the birds, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze were enough to calm her restless mind. She breathed in deeply, letting the peace of the moment fill her. As she walked, her thoughts turned back to the women she had spent those days with in Hawaii. Carol, Louise, Beverly, each of them had been there for her in a way her own family hadn't been. They had understood the quiet pain of being unseen, of giving without receiving, of being the one who always supported but was never truly supported in return. And in that shared experience, they had created something beautiful together, something real. It struck Marilyn then that her family's absence in her life had created space for something more important. She hadn't just lost a vacation, she had lost the weight of expectations that had been placed on her for years. She had lost the need to prove herself, to give everything and ask for nothing. It wasn't about the financial contributions or the endless sacrifices anymore. It was about self-love, about setting boundaries, and about accepting that sometimes you had to walk away from toxic relationships to protect your own well-being. She took another deep breath as she returned to the house. The message from Nathan was still on her phone, waiting for her. But this time, it didn't feel urgent. It didn't feel like something she had to respond to right away. She had already moved on. She had already found her healing. She had already discovered that the love she had been seeking from others had to start with herself first. Marilyn knew that the family dynamic had forever changed. The distance between her and Nathan, between her and Tanya, was not something that could be fixed by a simple conversation. What had happened, and the wounds would take time to heal. But the difference now was that Marilyn no longer saw herself as the one who needed to apologize, the one who needed to fix things. She had given enough. Now it was time for her to live her life for herself. If Nathan and Tanya wanted to be part of it, they would have to meet her where she was, on equal ground, where respect and mutual understanding were the foundation of the relationship. Marilyn turned her attention back to the phone, and after a moment of thought, she sent a simple response to Nathan's message. "I'm okay. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'm at peace. We can talk when you're ready, but right now, I'm taking time for myself." She didn't need to explain herself further. She didn't owe them an explanation for her happiness, for her decision to put herself first. That was something she had spent far too long neglecting, and now it was time to embrace it fully. As she put the phone down once again, Marilyn felt the deep sense of relief. It wasn't about cutting her family out of her life, but rather about prioritizing herself. She was no longer the one who was willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of others. She had learned that love didn't come with conditions, and neither should the love she had for herself. The days that followed were filled with simple pleasures, long walks in the garden, afternoons spent with her chosen family of women, and quiet moments of reflection. Marilyn felt herself growing stronger with each passing day. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. She had discovered the most important lesson of all. Sometimes you have to let go of what isn't serving you in order to make space for what truly will. Marilyn no longer defined herself by her family's love or approval. She had come to understand that she was worthy of love simply because she existed, because she had given so much to others, and because she had finally learned to give that same love and respect to herself. She was enough. And that realization, so simple yet so profound, was all she needed to begin this new chapter in her life. As she sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, Marilyn smiled. She didn't need anyone else to complete her. She was complete, just as she was, and that was the greatest gift she could give herself. The final lesson. Marilyn's journey to Hawaii had been a catalyst for deep transformation, but the healing didn't stop there. Returning to her everyday life after the trip felt different, more purposeful, more grounded. She didn't have all the answers, and the pain of family exclusion still lingered in the corners of her heart. But the clarity she had gained on that beautiful beach in Hawaii, amidst the laughter of friends, the soothing waves, and the freedom of rediscovery, was enough to carry her through. She didn't need her family's approval anymore. She didn't need to chase after their recognition. Marilyn had spent years giving so much of herself to others, and for the first time, she had learned to turn that same love inward. It was the most profound lesson of all. Self-love is not selfish, but essential. If you can't love yourself, how can you expect anyone else to truly see you? Marilyn had always been there for others, but now she was learning to be there for herself in ways she hadn't before. The phone message from Nathan, the one she had hesitated to respond to, faded into the background. She had given herself the space to decide how she wanted to move forward, not from a place of obligation, but from a place of clarity and strength. She didn't owe anyone an apology for her decision to prioritize her own well-being. She didn't need to explain herself. She had already done the hard work of healing, and that was enough. As the days passed, Marilyn began to feel her heart fill with gratitude, not just for the women she had met in Hawaii, but for the chance to start over. The world was full of possibilities, and she no longer felt confined by her past or by the expectations that had been placed on her for so many years. She didn't need to carry the weight of being the good mother, the perfect grandmother, or the self-sacrificing family member anymore. She was allowed to simply be herself, and that was more than enough. One evening, after a quiet dinner with Carol and Louise, Marilyn found herself reflecting on all that had happened in the past few months. She thought about the struggles she had faced, the moments of doubt, and the family that had rejected her. But she also thought about the strength she had found in herself, the bonds she had forged with the women who now stood beside her, and the incredible peace she had found in her own heart. It struck her then. She had spent so much time chasing after approval from her family, never realizing that the only approval she truly needed was her own. She had been waiting for them to recognize her worth, but in doing so, she had overlooked the most important lesson of all. She was already enough. She had always been enough. And in this moment, she knew that the only person she needed to make happy, the only person who could truly validate her, was herself. The journey was far from over, but Marilyn knew that she had taken the first steps toward a life she had longed for, a life where she was seen, where she was loved, not because of what she could give, but because of who she truly was. The family she had tried so hard to hold together was still a part of her story, but she no longer needed them to define her. She had found a new family, one built on mutual respect, love, and understanding. These women, her chosen family, were the ones who truly saw her. And with them by her side, she knew she could face anything. Marilyn stood up from her chair, gazing out at the quiet evening sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, faint but undeniable in their brilliance. She felt a quiet peace settle in her heart, a peace she hadn't known in years. The world was still full of uncertainties, but Marilyn no longer feared them. She had learned that strength came from within, that healing was possible, and that she was worthy of love just as much as anyone else. She wasn't waiting for someone else to give her permission to be happy, to be whole. She had already given herself that permission. As she looked up at the night sky, she whispered softly to herself, "I'm enough. I always have been." And with that, she closed her eyes, content in the knowledge she had finally found her place in the world, a place where she was seen, valued, and loved, not for what she could give, but for who she truly was.